Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? You guys wanted the scoop on Gilmore, Idaho, and well, let's just say it's got a lot more going on than meets the eye.
Yeah, it's one of those places that looks peaceful on the surface, mountains, ghost town vibes, but then you dig a little deeper and
You find out it's got a bit of a toxic secret, huh?
exactly, a whole history of lead contamination from the old mining days.
Okay, so picture this. You're hiking through these beautiful mountains and you stumble upon this charming little town, frozen in time like something out of a Western movie. What UT? Beneath all that charm is this invisible threat.
Lead in the soil, yeah.
And it's really a story about this clash between history, public health, and what it means to call a place home.
Yeah.
We're going to try to untangle it all today using a couple of key documents.
A 2023 health consultation report from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry.
ATSDR for short.
Right, and a 2024 response letter from the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality.
Or DEQ.
Yeah, these reports lay out the potential risks from all that lead and give us some clues as to why there's so much debate surrounding cleaning it up.
It's definitely a complicated situation.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's make sure everyone's on the same page. What exactly are we talking about when we say Superfund site?
Well, Superfund site is basically any place where hazardous waste is posing a serious risk to people's health and the environment.
Serious enough that the EPA steps in and says, all right, this needs a major cleanup.
Right. Now, in Gilmore's case, all that lead contamination from its mining days is what's landed it on the EPA's radar.
So these old mining operations, they basically left behind a ticking time bomb.
Pretty much. The ATSDR report highlights all these untreated waste piles near the mines, and then there's contaminated soil all over town, especially in the northern section where they used to transport the ore.
Okay, so we know where the contamination is coming from, but what does that actually mean for people? Well, that's where the health risks come in. The ATSDR report gets really specific about how lead exposure can harm both children and adults.
And it's not just like, oh, you might get a little sick. We're talking about some serious stuff, right?
Absolutely. For kids, even small amounts of lead can cause developmental delays and learning difficulties.
And for adults.
It can mess with your nervous system, your kidneys, your blood pressure.
And get this, the report says there's no safe level of lead exposure, period.
So how are people actually getting exposed in Gilmore? I mean, is it just from being near the old mine sites?
It's a little more complicated than that. The main way people are getting exposed is by ingesting contaminated soil or dust. Kids playing outside, people working in their gardens.
Yeah.
Even just inhaling dust particles can be a problem.
So it's not just about avoiding the obvious danger zones. It's about the everyday activities that could expose you to lead without even realizing it.
Right. And to figure out just how much lead might be getting into people's systems, the ATSDR report actually modeled different exposure scenarios. Hold on, they can predict how much lead is getting into people based on where they spend their time in Gilmore.
They can estimate blood lead levels based on the soil contamination and how long someone is exposed to it. And the results are pretty concerning, especially for kids.
Okay, so spill the tea. What kind of blood lead levels are we talking about here?
Well, for kids who spend even just one day a week in certain areas of Gilmore for 3 months, the report predicts they have a greater than 5% chance of having elevated blood lead levels.
And if they spend more time there?
The risk goes up, and in the northern section of town, where the contamination is the worst, the report predicts a 90% chance of a child having a blood lead level greater than 20 IR-AGL if they stay in the area for 90 days.
And to put that into perspective, 20 IR-AGL is more than double what the CDC considers acceptable, right?
Yeah, it's definitely cause for concern. So we've got this serious health hazard, a contaminated site, and that's where the whole Superfund process comes in.
All right, let's talk about that. How does the EPA decide whether or not to declare a site a Superfund site, and where does Gilmore fall in that process?
Well, it all starts with an assessment to see how bad the contamination is and what the potential risks are. If they determine it's serious enough, the site can get listed on the National Priorities List. We call it the NPL for short, which is basically the EPA's list of the most contaminated sites in the country.
So is Gilmore on that list?
That's where things get a little tricky. The DEQ's letter from 2024 mentions that the Superfund route, specifically getting Gilmore on the NPL, was being considered as a way to clean up the site.
Okay, so they were thinking about it, but it sounds like they were still in the early stages, trying to figure out what the community wanted to do.
Yeah, they were gathering feedback and exploring different options.
So they were considering making Gilmore a Superfund site, but there might have been some pushback from the community. Why wouldn't people want a Superfund site cleaned up? Especially knowing all the health risks we just talked about.
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of the debate surrounding Gilmore. You'd think protecting people's health would be the top priority, but there's often more to the story.
What else is going on here? Why the hesitation about the Superfund designation?
Well, in the DEQ letter, there's mention of a citizen petition where the community basically asked the DEQ to back off, stop all the sampling and testing, and leave Gilmore as is.
Wow. So they're basically saying, thanks, but no thanks. We'll handle this ourselves. That's a pretty strong stance.
It is, and it suggests that there are other factors at play here. It's not just about the science of lead contamination, but also about people's homes, their history, their connection to this place.
You know, it makes sense when you think about it. The ATSDR report mentions how Gilmore is this popular spot for recreation. People are drawn to its ghost town charm, the beautiful scenery. It's easy to see how those personal attachments could make it hard to accept that there's this underlying problem.
Exactly. And then you add in the distrust of government intervention, something you often see in rural communities, and suddenly the idea of the EPA coming in and taking over might not be so appealing.
So maybe it's not that people are denying the health risks, but they see the Superfund designation as a bigger threat to their way of life.
Right, like the cure is worse than the disease. The DEQ letter even mentions concerns about property values going down and restrictions on how people can use their land if Gilmore becomes a Superfund site.
It's understandable. When you're worried about losing your home or your freedom to use your land the way you want, those long-term health risks might seem less urgent.
It's about weighing competing priorities, and for some people, those economic and personal freedoms outweigh the health concern.
But let's not forget, the ATSDR report makes it very clear that those health concerns are nothing to scoff at. Those blood lead levels we talked about, especially for kids spending time in the northern part of town, are way beyond what's considered safe.
And it's not just about the numbers. The report goes into detail about the real-world consequences of lead exposure, damage to children's developing brains, impacting their ability to learn and grow. For adults, there's the risk of cardiovascular problems, kidney disease, even reproductive issues.
It's a lot to take in, and I imagine it's even more concerning for groups like the Shoshone-Bannock tribes who have this deep cultural connection to the land.
Absolutely. The report mentions their worry that the contamination could impact their traditional practices, which involve using soil from the area. It really highlights that this issue goes beyond individual health risks. We're talking about potential harm to cultural traditions and a way of life that's been passed down for generations.
So we've got this whole web of competing interests: public health, individual rights, economic concerns, cultural heritage. It's a lot to untangle, and it makes you wonder if there's any way to find a solution that addresses everything.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The DEQ, in their 2024 letter, seemed to be moving away from the Superfund designation and focusing on providing information and support to individual landowners who want to mitigate the risks on their own property.
So instead of a top-down EPA-led cleanup, they're leaving it up to individual residents to decide how to deal with the contamination.
It seems like that's the direction they're heading in. It's definitely a different approach than what the ATSDR report recommends, which called for swift action to remove or contain the contamination.
It sounds like they're trying to find a middle ground, trying to balance addressing the health risks with respecting the community's autonomy. But does that really work? Can you really tackle a problem as big as this without a coordinated effort?
That's a great question. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at what the DEQ's approach could mean for Gilmore and for other communities facing similar challenges.
It's almost like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Trying to protect people's health while also respecting their way of life.
It really highlights how complicated environmental cleanup can be. Sometimes it's not just about finding the right technical solution.
There's this whole human element that you have to consider, right?
Absolutely. You have to think about people's feelings, their livelihoods, their connections to the land.
And in Gilmore, those connections run pretty deep.
Oh, yeah. The ATSDR report talks about how popular it is for recreation, and you can see why people are drawn to that ghost town atmosphere, those beautiful mountains. It's easy to understand why they might be hesitant to let go of that.
Especially if they see the EPA coming in as some kind of outside force trying to change things.
That distrust of government intervention can be a big factor, especially in rural communities.
So it's not that they don't believe the lead is a problem, but they see the Superfund designation as this even bigger threat to their way of life.
It's possible. The DEQ letter actually mentions concerns about property values going down and restrictions on land use if Gilmore becomes a Superfund site.
So if you're worried about your property becoming worthless or losing the freedom to use your land the way you want, suddenly those long-term health risks might not seem so bad.
Right. It becomes a matter of priorities. And for some people, those economic and personal freedoms are more important than the potential health risks.
But we can't forget that the ATSDR report was pretty clear about those risks. The blood lead modeling they did painted a pretty scary picture, especially for kids.
Yeah, those estimated blood lead levels were way above what's considered safe, particularly in the northern part of town.
And it's not just about the numbers either. The report talks about all the real-world health problems that lead exposure can cause.
Developmental delays in children, learning difficulties, cardiovascular issues, kidney problems, even reproductive issues in adults. It's a long list.
It makes you wonder what this all means for groups like the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, who have such a strong cultural connection to this land.
The report specifically mentions their concerns about the contamination impacting their traditional practices, which involve using soil from the area.
It really shows how this goes beyond just individual health risks, doesn't it?
Definitely. We're talking about potential harm to cultural traditions and a way of life that's been passed down for generations.
So we've got all these competing interests: public health, individual rights, economic concerns, cultural heritage. It seems almost impossible to find a solution that satisfies everyone.
That's the challenge, isn't it? Finding a way to balance all those competing needs.
It looks like the DEQ is trying to do just that. In their 2024 letter, they seem to be shifting away from the Superfund designation and focusing more on supporting individual landowners who want to deal with the contamination on their own property.
So instead of a big EPA-led cleanup, they're going for a more localized approach.
It seems that way. It's a very different strategy than what the ATSDR report recommended, which was to take swift action to remove or contain the contamination.
So are they basically saying we trust the community to handle this on their own terms?
It seems like they're trying to find a middle ground between addressing the health risks and respecting the community's desire to make their own decisions.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Will those individual efforts be enough to protect everyone's health? Or will the problem just keep lingering?
And will it cause even more problems down the road? Those are some big questions, and that's what we're going to dig into in the final part of our deep dives. It's kind of like they're trying to thread a needle, isn't it? Trying to find that sweet spot between keeping people safe and letting them live their lives.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, and it really shows how complicated environmental cleanup can be. It's not always as simple as just identifying the problem and fixing it.
There are all these other factors to consider.
Exactly. The human element, the economics, the history of a place.
And in Gilmore's case, there's also that strong sense of community and independence.
Right. They don't want to feel like outsiders are coming in and telling them what to do.
Which is understandable. But it does make you wonder, what happens when a community pushes back against a solution that's meant to protect them? How do you balance those competing interests?
That's the question, isn't it? And the DEQ's decision to step back from the Superfund route suggests they're trying to find a different way to address the problem.
A way that gives the community more control.
Exactly. But that approach also comes with its own set of risks.
Like what?
Well, if individual landowners are left to deal with the contamination on their own, will those efforts be enough to protect everyone?
And will it create this patchwork of protection where some areas are cleaned up and others aren't?
Right, and without a comprehensive plan, the overall health risks might not be fully addressed.
And let's not forget what the ATSDR report said. They were pretty adamant that action needed to be taken.
They definitely didn't sugarcoat the risks.
They called for swift action to reduce exposure, especially for children.
Because kids are the most vulnerable to the effects of lead.
So what does this all mean for Gilmore? What's the likely outcome of this more hands-off approach?
It's hard to say for sure. It really depends on how the community responds. Will they take the initiative to clean up their properties? Will they prioritize areas where kids spend time?
Will they work together to make sure everyone is protected?
Those are all big questions. And the answers will determine whether this approach is successful or not.
It's a bit of a gamble, isn't it? Putting the fate of the community in their own hands.
It is, but it also shows a certain level of trust in the community's ability to do what's right.
It's like they're saying, we believe you can handle this.
Exactly. And hopefully they're right.
So what can our listeners take away from all of this? What have we learned from this deep dive into Gilmore, Idaho?
Well, I think it shows just how complicated environmental issues can be. It's not always black and white.
There are often competing interests and different perspectives to consider.
And sometimes finding the right solution means finding a balance between those perspectives.
It also highlights the importance of community involvement in these kinds of decisions.
People need to feel like they have a voice in what happens to their community.
And they need to be informed about the risks and the options available to them.
Because ultimately, it's their health and their future that's at stake.
So if you're facing a similar situation in your own community, what can you do?
Well, first of all, get informed. Learn about the issue, the potential risks, and the different solutions that are being proposed.
Talk to your neighbors, your local officials, and the experts.
And don't be afraid to ask questions and share your concerns.
Because your voice matters. And by working together, we can create a healthier and safer future for everyone.
Well said.
That's it for our deep dive into Gilmore, Idaho. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
And we hope it encourages you to get involved in your own community and make a difference.
Thanks for listening.